Hi, I'm Abhijan Toto, and I am the curator of In the Forest, Even the Air Breathes, which opens on the 1st of October at the GAMeC in Bergamo, as part of the 10th edition of the Premio Lorenzo Bonaldi. In the Forest, Even the Air Breathes is a project that emerges out of the ongoing research of the forest curriculum, which is a platform founded by myself and Pujita Guha in 2018. We have, over the course of several years, been conducting research, workshops, and other kinds of programs, including making publications and exhibitions across the region, both within Asia and elsewhere. We work collaboratively with institutions, individuals, artists, organizations for the various activities of the forest curriculum. Now, as part of the research of this particular exhibition, we are looking very specifically at the ways in which nature is thought of and understood within the context of what is known as zoomia. So zoomia is a term defined by James C. Scott and Willem van Schandel, who are anthropologists who use it to understand the very particular relationship to nature and states that people in the highlands, in the continuously forested belt that connects India, Southeast Asia, all the way into the Philippine archipelago, where indigenous people, guerrilla fighters, Buddhist monks, and various other communities, always at a distance, always at a removed relationship to states, have found refuge, have found history, have found community and identity. We're particularly interested in the ways in which the cosmologies of this region might be thought of to challenge our very state-centered and particularly Western-centered notions of nature as a way of offering an alternative framework from which to understand our current ecological moment. Thinking about not an alternative to the idea of the Anthropocene as a singular idea, but rather as a conglomeration of many worlds that can be thought of at various times, at various speeds, and at various intensities together. Central to this is understanding that nature is not an ahistorical artifact, but rather encompasses various forms of history, not only of linear time, but of multiplicities. And in this regard, this idea of non-human worlds, both animal, human, and what is called the supernatural, come together. So, walking into this exhibition, which is divided into three sections, the first work that one sees is of the Singaporean artist Robert Zhao Ranhui, which is made under the name of his collective, the Institute for Critical Zoologists. This particular work is called The Pond, and looks at the particular history of the forest on the Queen's Own Hill in Singapore. The Queen's Own Hill is a very interesting space which started out as a barracks during the British colonial period, and then was abandoned and was sort of rewilded into what it is today. And at various times in its history was used by various communities, including most recently in the 70s and 80s by Southeast Asian migrant workers who used it as a brothel and as a space of inhabitation and sexual encounters. It was then, following a purge of illegal immigrants and their hideouts, this space became even more rewilded, and therefore became a refuge for various species in Singapore that have otherwise disappeared. On the right, we see the work of Wen Trin T, a work known as Landscapes 1. Landscapes 1 is composed of a series of images that Wen Trin T found online, which are of various people standing within landscapes which are otherwise devoid of markers to which they are pointing. This continuous slideshow shows a succession of images of people pointing to memories that leave no physical trace, but weigh deeply on histories, thinking both about the history of the Vietnam War, but also of subsequent post-colonial occupations of displacements within the context of contemporary Vietnamese history. And then on the left is the publication project. The publication project brings into the exhibition space the research element of the forest curriculum, within this project, within the publication project, which is made in cooperation with RAR Editions from Indonesia, produced with Kunci Coffee Station, I've invited 5 members of our collective: Pujita Guha, who's the co-director, Charat Polmuk, who's a professor of literature here in Bangkok, and Wong Bing Hao, who's a curator and researcher from Singapore, Huing Nung, who's an activist and artist from Singapore as well as Christian Tablazon from the Philippines, who runs a fantastic space there called in Los Baños, called Nomina Nuda. These 5 publications, one with Pujita's, which looks at the opium trade, Charat's, which looks at leftist histories of literature in Lao, Wong Bing Hao, who looks at transness as a concept, both as a political identity as well as a sexual one. Huing, which offers a manual of thinking about toxicity of soil and environments within Southeast Asia. And finally, Christians, which looks at the histories of nature and its control within the Philippines, understanding its relationship to dictatorship and colonialism. These 5 publications together are not interpretations of the show as such, but are an integral part of it, moving the thematics of the exhibition into various directions. Moving further into the next section of the show, which focuses on the relationship between the forest and the military-industrial complex, looking both at ongoing histories of occupation and resistance, but also at histories of violence as they have been enacted here, both by colonialism and subsequent histories. The 3 works in this particular section are a series of drawings by Joydeep Raja. Joydeep is an artist from the Tripura community in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, which is on the periphery of the Zomian region. The Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh are one of the most militarized zones within South Asia, and are in fact under continuing occupation by the Bangladeshi National Army, which routinely dispossesses indigenous peoples, most recently with regards to the creation of a large coal power plant within the region, to which Joydeep responds. Joydeep's drawings recall his memories of growing up in a militarized zone where the rituals of childhood become replaced by machinery and guns, and the idea of a safe space becomes one that is always elusive and in fact found always within the space of the forest. In the center of the space is the work by Carl Castro, who is an activist and graphic designer from the Philippines, working very closely with various political collectives within the country. This particular work is connected to the history of resistance by the Communist Party of the Philippines, the National People's Army of the Philippines, who are a guerrilla organization that have been in active resistance of the Philippine government since the 70s. And have continued to build up their resistance for many years, and in fact have always had more progressive policies than the national government ever has, including social welfare and rights for women and LGBTQ communities. This particular series focuses on the hands and feet of members of the resistance movement as a way of looking at the co-implication between resistance and the forest in the Philippines. Finally, within the section is the work of Vietnamese-German artist Song Thieu. Song's work refers to the history of the ghost tapes, particularly the ghost tape number 10, which was used by the CIA during the Vietnam War. It's a very particular history which a song describes as the first sound work, where the CIA used various recordings of what they imagined to be a Vietnamese ritual sound and used it to compose this soundtrack, which they then offered to soldiers to walk into the forest and blast at the Viet Cong, or where they thought the Viet Cong were hiding. The central sound within that was of a small son being visited by the ghost of his father, who was telling him to give up and surrender to the Americans because all resistance is futile. And it is accompanied by various sounds of the forest, including, very interestingly, the sound of a tiger roaring, which was actually recorded here in the zoo in Bangkok. The song turns this on its head with a piece titled Song for Unattended Items, which in fact layers in another history of violence of contemporary surveillance cultures in the history of the war on terror, of the idea of the unattended item of baggage left in an airport, which becomes an item of suspicion. Song therefore layers her history as a Vietnamese artist as well as as a person of color within a primarily white society, wherein one is always looked upon with suspicion as a sort of a piece of unattended baggage which might at any moment explode. She therefore layers these different ideas of imperialism together to produce a sonic environment. In the final section, which looks very specifically at the relationship between cosmology and resistance, we have the works of Kwe Sam Nang and So Yun Wei. Kwe Sam Nang's work emerges out of a very particular engagement with the Chong community in the Areng Valley region in Cambodia. Sam Nang worked with the activists and community leaders within the community when they were in fact resisting the occupation of their valley and of their forest by the Chinese state-owned construction company Sino-Hydro, who had planned to drown out the entire valley without any consultation with the Cambodian people or the local communities, and they led an ultimately successful resistance against this. For Sam Nang, what was really interesting was not only the loss of the human communities and lives, but also what it meant in terms of the loss of non-human life within that region. And Sam Nang worked with a classically trained Cambodian dancer to enact the comings and goings and appearances of certain spirits who are the family deities of various families within the Chong community in that area. So we see a peacock, we see a alligator, we see a wild boar all appearing and disappearing and occupying space, and in fact becoming part of what produces that act of resistance within the community. Finally, we have the two serpents of So Yun Wei, which in fact point to her own position as a Burmese woman, but also as a Chinese Burmese artist thinking within the context of a multi-ethnic society. She looks at the particular history of her family deities, which her grandmother tells her were dragons before they moved to Burma. Upon moving to Burma, she says that her grandmother transformed their family deities from dragons into snakes, and she calls them the serpent daughters of a Chinese dragon as a way of hybridizing the identities and the ways of occupying history within a new context. So Yun Wei's work thus points to how deeply connected our cosmological notions of identity are with our ways of telling history and personal narratives. It also points to the idea, which is very central within the Thinking of the Forest curriculum, that identity is never a single solid thing, but rather always produces and reproduces themselves. In fact, in the space of the forest, identity is all the more malleable. One can enter the forest as a Laotian fleeing persecution and come out of the jungle as a Cambodian who is dealing in the opium trade, or a Thai citizen who then becomes a sex worker in the streets of Chiang Mai, or any number of identities. It can also be an American spy who enters the forest and becomes a Japanese double agent or a Thai triple agent. It produces a myriad of worlds which come together in both conflict and concert, which opens up our understandings of the many worlds that we continuously inhabit. I hope you will enjoy the show, which will last till the 14th of February and will be accompanied by a public program entitled The Forest is in the City is in the Forest, which is produced in collaboration with the Rat School of Art in Seoul and funded by the Arco Foundation of Korea. The public program, which will be broken up into 2 sessions a month, will involve artists and curators and researchers from all over the world within our network, and will accompany this exhibition as another way of opening up new conversations. I hope you'll enjoy this show. Thank you very much.